In the introductory modules, the document that's available on the Better Start website, there are some points about fund mapping in here. There will also be available, I think, as of tomorrow, the latest or the final version of the fund mapping tool. So this is the actual guidance with the forms. A lot of you will have seen a version of this because your site managers will have shared it, but there were a few bits of feedback that we had that we wanted to incorporate, so we now have a final version. But as I said, it's only final in as much as it's our guidance, but it's not the final word. You will shape it as to what you can do locally. So I've worked with a lot of local authorities and a lot of voluntary organisations, and I often ask the question, so how much do you spend on children? How many children are there? What do you do with your money? And it's quite surprising how blank the faces are when I ask that question, because most people are very aware of what they do with their budget, but very few people have that overview. So when we worked in Birmingham, and we pulled people together in a room much like this, and we said, so how much do you spend on children? No one had any idea that there was in between 1.3 and 1.5 billion spent in total on children. Some people didn't know that there were 250,000 children in the city that were being served. Now, it's a long time ago, people are much more in touch with data, but these are these big issues that they want to have people having a common understanding about through your fund mapping. So it sounds a bit glib, but these are large amounts of money that we're spending on large numbers of children, and we want to get those facts straight for this work that we're doing. So I'm hoping in your areas now you've probably got a much better handle on some of these issues about how much money you're spending in total, what you're doing, how many children. But the fund mapping tool, I hope, will help you take that down to another level of detail. Normally when we work with an authority, we don't actually have the money that BIG is bringing. So we've given an example of the work up in Perth and Ross. They've done a fund mapping exercise recently, and on the back of that, they realised that they were spending about £3 or £4 million on a whole bunch of fairly small projects across the authority and across agencies, and they weren't persuaded that those projects were the best use of money. Now, it's not that they're going to go ahead and decommission those projects straight away, but it made them aware that they weren't using all of their money as effectively as they might. And seeing the fund mapping laid out gave the leaders in the local authority the confidence to commit to earmarking 2% of their total expenditure for early intervention and prevention. Now, they're not going to have their hands on that next week. It's going to be an incremental process. But from the chief exec down to the finance director, across to the director of children's services, there is a commitment to find 2% of total expenditure and earmark it for prevention and early intervention over the next 3 to 4 years, and it has elected member support. So once you've got data about how your children are doing and information about what your current investments are, it is possible to get this type of commitment. And you're in a fortunate position because you're hopefully all going to, or some of you, will get large investments from lottery on top of this. So, these are the types of questions we're encouraging you to understand with your fund mapping work. So hopefully this will feel very familiar if you've had a chance to cast your eye over the notes in the introductory modules, or if you've had a look at the fund mapping tool. And it seems quite basic. So some of this information you may well have at your fingertips already, maybe even put it in your original bid. So you want to know how many children you have, who's using which services, so how many children are using social services, using care, how many kids in state-maintained schools, basic figures about children and their use of services. What do you invest in the total? What are the unit costs for different services? What sort of proportion is currently going into prevention and early intervention? This is probably one of the harder figures to arrive at. And what sort of percentage are you investing in evidence-based programs now? Now, we have yet to work in an authority where that figure is anywhere near 1% of total expenditure. And that in itself is quite a sobering statistic, that we are spending less than 1% of all our money on things that would be deemed to be evidence-based. Now we could have a whole debate about what's evidence-based, and perhaps that definition is too tight, but when it comes down to it, what we're talking about at the moment is very small amounts of total spend going into evidence-based activity. So what we've tried to put together for you is a method, and it's basically 5 steps. You need to design a process that is suitable to your circumstances. So in the fund mapping tool, we give you various guidance, various parameters. You're going to have to decide who can be involved. Some of you I've heard already have got teams of people who are going to be able to devote a huge amount of time to this. Other areas it might have to be part of one person's job. So already I can see that some of the sites will have very fine-grained, in-depth analysis about their expenditures, and others it may be a sort of more general big picture. Once you've managed to design a process and you've collected the data, we do want to emphasise that we are not looking for literal sort of penny, pounds and pennies. This is not about detail. This is about estimations. This is about being able to say, we're currently investing about 5% of our resources in early intervention, or we know that 0.5% of our spend is going on evidence-based programmes, or the split between targeted spend and universal spend is about 80-20. It's at that level. We're not asking you to do an accounting job. We're asking you to describe in fairly big picture statements how overall money has been spent across all agencies that have a stake in children. So when you're designing the process, we'll come on to the detail of that in a moment, you've obviously got to set some parameters, because it could be this big or it could be this big. Yeah? Obviously you need to analyse the data, and one of the things we found, again doing this work, is you can end up with huge amounts of data, but it's very difficult to interpret. So clearly it's going to be very important to have your finance managers and officers being able to help you to understand the data and be able to check in, perhaps with budget holders and others, whether you're understanding it correctly. So a very important part of the process for us when we were in Perth and Kinross was actually being able to sense check what we thought we were taking from the data as to whether it was what they understood. So we said, well, you're making this £1 million investment in this programme. No, that's not what we're doing, that's a different project or something else. So there does need to be a kind of check-in to make sure you're understanding the figures in the right way. And I think having your finance lead is non-negotiable. They need to be able to be at the strategy days, or at least have been consulted with ahead of those strategy days to say, yes, this to me is a plausible interpretation of the information you've collected. Sorry about the size of the font, I'll walk you through this. So this probably is the work that you've either done already or you're starting, but you're setting the parameters to the process of gathering your funding data. First of all, who can you rely on to actually be involved, and how much time can they give between now and so the end of October really, you need to be pulling it all together. So you've got a couple of months, just under a couple of months, to do this piece of work. I know it's a phenomenally tight timescale, so it needs to be a reasonable aspiration for what you can produce in that time. So what are the parameters? So which agencies and departments will you collect data from? Clearly it's essential that you have health, as they are probably the major investor in the early years, but you want to understand what spending is in education in early years, in social care, public health. Now there are other agencies where you might be interested, and it might be desirable to understand what's been spent in youth offending, in police, in other voluntary sector services. That's where you've got to make a judgment. What's going to be doable, and what's going to be really help to create a full picture of what's been spent on children. Which geographic area? We recommend that you're able to put together a picture for your overall local authority area, and also for your selected area for Better Start. Again, it's a choice. But if you're making a case to lottery about how you currently spend your money and how you're going to spend that money differently, there needs to be some sense that you've got a good picture of what's currently going on, both local authority-wide and in your areas. But again, you will have to make that judgment as to what's possible in the timescale. What fiscal year are you going to look at? What's, again, your finance lead will be able to give you the best steer on what time period you're looking at. And what population? Again, you need to understand at a minimum what's been spent on children and families conception to 3. But it would be highly desirable to understand what's been spent on all children, because this is all about redirection and reinvestment of resources. So in some ways, it won't be that helpful to only know current spend on the 0 to 3s. But again, will that be possible with the time that you've got and with the type of data that you have access to? And which budget holders is it going to be useful to get involved in the process? So all things that I'm sure you've already considered, but we've just tried to lay it out as a series of steps and questions for you to make sure you've considered, so that we don't get to November and you go, oh, you didn't tell us that, you didn't suggest that. So I want to walk you through a sample output, how the data might look. Again, this is by no means saying it must look like this, but these are the types of figures that are going to be useful for when you bring everyone together in the room at the end of the year, and will be important to be sharing with lottery so they can get a sense of how current investments are looking. But before we go on to the sample output, are there any questions or issues that you have so far, either things that you're encountering in your sites at the moment as you're trying to get this work kicked off, or any questions about what I've asked or sent out already? Yes. Can you have a microphone? Sorry.
If I understand it correctly, this is the money laundering part before it gets to the bank.
Sorry?
This is the money laundering before it gets to the bank. So in order for the bank to do its work effectively, you need to have laundered the money in the first place.
I'm not sure about the term laundering.
Okay. So you're clearing the money up in order for the bank's analysis to work properly. So this comes before the bank.
Yes. This is more basic than that. This is... Sorry. I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but the question was phrased as, is this the money laundering process before the money goes to the bank? This is being able to understand how you're currently spending your money and feeding it into the strategy development days in November, December, so that you've got an understanding of how money is currently spent. So that's the main function.
But for the bank to do its work, you have to do this bit first.
I think this is essential for the lottery to understand how you're currently spending your money. I suppose one thing I would highlight, lottery is very concerned that the money that you receive is not used to backfill existing services. So we do need to understand how money is currently been spent at a minimum to see that when you receive your investment, it doesn't go to plug existing gaps.
In which case, can you illustrate the relationship between this and then what the bank does in the future?
Sure, I would personally completely separate how we're thinking about the bank from this. This is a very basic descriptive piece of work to help you at the end of the year make decisions about how you would want to spend your lottery investment compared to what you're currently spending money on. But if I can take it as a point, because the bank issue is not something I'm so familiar with, I think Michael stepped out. So I want to note it as a helpful question that you've raised.
All right.
Okay. Another question.
It does what you're going to do on This is more of an observation, really. We started to do some of the mapping for our previous early intervention strategy. One of the difficulties we had is around GP spend per GP on children.
Yeah.
And we kind of use the 40% amount for activity, but that also doesn't equate to budget. And so there are going to be some discrepancies around that. And I guess it's just about clarity that we can use those sort of high level.
Absolutely. And again, this is what I'm saying, you're doing this piece of work in a very short space of time. There'll be certain figures that you'll put in that will have to be estimates, there'll have to be assumptions. And as long as you're clear what the assumption is and how you arrive at it. That's absolutely essential that you have to do that. Some things I would imagine are going to be quite straightforward to get, like I hope spend on health visiting and midwifery. But like you say, where you've got a service like GPs and the police, where a proportion of their time is spent on the population you're interested in, it can probably be nothing more than an estimate. Yeah, that's absolutely.
CCG should have a cost on CCG children's league should have a cost per head physical population, so there should be a cost that's affiliated with
So you can do a reasonable estimate.
If you know what the paediatric child population is, there's your cost. I don't know how to work on, you won't know how many children have access, but usually.
Yeah, and that's what we've done. It's a very broad estimate.
Other comments or
So a really little question. When you
Yes.
say the age of 3, do you mean 2 years, 11 months and whatever days, or do you mean 3 years, 11 months and whatever days? It's still the
Can I just clarify what we've been saying is the age factor? We were conception through to...
There's a definitive answer. I honestly can't remember what it is.
Yeah, sorry. We believe, and we will do an email round to confirm that it is up to the 4th birthday, so it is for the duration of being 3. All right then, let's move on. You'll probably find this to be incredibly basic, but if you can put together a basic picture that you have confidence in, that will be sufficient, and anything extra will be a bonus. So we've literally done it as a template, so there aren't figures in here if you want to put any sort of things in your mind. This is just an example of how you might, the end point. Now, when you're doing a piece of collecting data and doing analysis, you want to know where you're trying to end up. We want you to be able to say, obviously, basic things about how many children there are, how many children are 0 to 3, total spend across the agencies, and therefore an approximate amount for every child. An estimate of what's targeted and what's universal. What the approximate spend per head is on universal. The approximate spend per head on targeted. The number of people who work with children. When we did the work in Birmingham, there were 250,000 children. Do you know how many people in Birmingham were working face-to-face with children? This is people, not FTEs. There's 50,000 people who were working face-to-face with children. So for every child, there was about one person who was working face-to-face. So things like that are very important when you're thinking about how you might be reorienting or redirecting your resources or making propositions for how you might be changing your resources. I'm hoping you'll be able to get an overall figure of total expenditure on your targeted area. And we know you're going to have to make some quite general assumptions about spend in your areas. For example, if you have a children's centre, how do you account for how that spend is divvied up across the areas? As long as you're very clear about the assumptions, that's all that matters. We know you're going to have to make a lot of assumptions. This is not about detailed accounting. So we hope you'll be able to break it down by agency so that we can see the percentage. And this is for all children. So hopefully we can get to a point where you can present this picture for all children, the same picture for children 0 to 3, this picture for the whole authority, and this picture for your targeted area. That's kind of the ideal end point. What investment is targeted? They're able to put some estimates on the targeted spend. Some estimates on the average cost of services. Yeah, estimate of what's been spent on evidence-based activity. Other significant spend on prevention and early intervention. It might prompt you to be able to start thinking about the things that you can do differently because of the numbers of people that you know who are occupying specific roles. what's been said in the target area. Again, similar sorts of information, but this time at the area level. Some of you who've had a chance to look at the fund mapping tool will know that it's in 3 parts. So it gives you sheets for working through the, how to get the initial information, how to get information on the programs, and there's a third section which is encouraging you to think about how what you're spending your money on aligns with outcomes. And I know I've had some questions from people about how this is going to be done and whether this is essential. As I said before, there are parts in here that are essential and some that are optional. This is very much optional. But if you can get to the point of being able to say, well, we spend 20 million, and actually probably 80% of it goes on improving educational skills and attainment, probably about 2% on improving emotional well-being, maybe about 1% on positive behaviour. We can start getting a sense of how you spend your money and how that's aligned with outcomes. And again, this is a very different way of thinking, but this whole piece of work is about how you're improving particular outcomes for children. And we do need to have a sense at the outset of what your current investments are in improving those outcomes. Yeah.
Before you were talking about looking at it as a system-wide,
Yes.
but I noticed this time you've really talked about the establishment spend rather than the voluntary sector spend as well. So are you expecting us to map the whole picture to get a current sort of state view, including voluntary?
I would really hope that you have voluntary sector spend in there. I think one of the challenges is a lot of the voluntary sector money will have come through the statutory sector. So we've got to be able to make sure we don't double count the money. So I would hope you can separate out voluntary sector money that is statutory money from voluntary sector money that is philanthropic and from other sources. Really important not to double count. Thank you, it's a really helpful point. So we definitely want to see voluntary sector spend on here, but we need to make sure it's clear that it's extra money.
What modelling are you expecting to see around demographic change and trends that have written out students and children disability and stuff like that? You talk very much about snapshots. Do you expect to see anything different?
For this piece of work, for the strategy days, it's a snapshot. I think we need to have a separate conversation about how we might be expecting you to do modelling for the bid, and this comes down to some of the clarifications that we need to have with lottery about what's expected to be in that submission. So I can't answer that now, but I will note it down as a question and make sure we have an answer for you. So this is the type of output we're encouraging you to produce. You might be either reassured that that's very basic and straightforward, or feeling really anxious that that's far more complex than you feel able to put together. The fund mapping tool is intended to give you guidance to hopefully get to that point. It's got the preamble about the steps. It has 3 fact sheets, one which breaks down all the different headings of information we're encouraging you to collect. Another fact sheet about collecting information around expenditure on programmes, and the one at the back around mapping this to outcomes. It's very basic. It's trying to give an overview of how we spend our money, what we spend it on, and some sense of how we're improving outcomes. So that's really what I want to say about fund mapping. I'd be very interested to have comments and any questions. Yes.
Would you expect this analysis to include universal services like swim parks and stuff like that?
Again, this is where when you're designing your process, you need to decide which agencies are part of it. And if you're going to go to parks and recreation or community services, then fine. But we're not going to require you to do that. The key ones are education, social care, health, early years. understanding in your case by including more expenditure, but being able to be clear about what that is, then by all means do. The key ones are health education and social care. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Remember why you're doing this. This is to show that, well, to be honest, this will show how relatively little we spend on the 0 to 3s, how relatively little we spend on these target outcomes, and hopefully identify opportunities for where money should be redirected or reinvested over time. That's the function of this information. It's to engage people who are around the table to get an overall view of how money has been spent and to ask questions about it. It's not about providing a definitive account of every penny, and it's not about setting up the bank. It's more general than that. Just to wrap up, bear in mind that all these tools we're developing, we're open to refining them and to improving them, so we think this is the latest version. If we get feedback from you and it needs improvement, we're very happy to have that. Your site managers will work with you to work through this, but they are there to provide advice and support. They cannot do the fund mapping for you. They will help as much as they can and they'll be a critical friend.